Does it show up as a full screen?
Yes.
Okay. And do you want to hit the record button or do I have to do that?
I already hit it. I'm just making sure. I don't know, we should wait a bit in case more attendees log on. Maybe until 6:40.
Yeah, that sounds good. Can you make sure that the people that are there right now can hear us? Can they hear us, Gabby? So it looks like they can hear us.
Like they can?
Yeah. I just got a response from Edith saying that she can hear us.
Okay. Okay, so we'll just wait until 6:40 since a couple more people logged on right now.
Okay. And you said you pressed the record button, or you're gonna press it.
I already pressed it.
Okay.
Okay, hello everyone. I currently unmuted all of our attendees, but I'll proceed it and go ahead to mute you in a bit. I just want to explain a bit of our guidelines for the webinar. So first of all, welcome to the MiMentor Demystifying the Medical School Application Process webinar. We really hope to get all of your questions answered and really give you our perspective that we really gained during our application process that just ended pretty much. So all of you we won't be able to hear you, but if you see the hand feature and the question feature, you can use those, and then we will go ahead and answer your question. With the hand feature, I will mute you, and then you can ask your question if you prefer not to type it in. Does that make sense to all of the attendees?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone just to avoid any background noise from all of our different locations where we're calling in. Only the organizers and panelists will be unmuted. Okay, Leo, can you start off the presentation?
Okay. So welcome everyone. Uh, we'll start off with introductions. Our goal today is to pretty much go over the application and hopefully provide you with our own experiences as how we dealt with the application and what we learned from this process, and hopefully share that knowledge with you. So first I'll have Gabriela Gonzalez present herself, and then I'll go next.
Hello, everyone. I already sort of talked a bit to you. Call me Gabby. I went to UCLA, grew up in Los Angeles, and after graduating from UCLA in 2013, I completed the UC Davis post-baccalaureate program through the School of Medicine. Once I finished it in June, I retook my MCAT that summer and applied that summer as well. And I was luckily accepted in many schools, and I will be attending UCLA Prime.
So hi everyone. Again, my name is Leonel Martinez, but everyone calls me Leo. I graduated from UCLA in 2008 as a psychobio major and Chicano studies minor. I did a informal postdoc for for 3 years, and then I, at the same time, working full time as a research assistant at UCLA. I did my MCAT while working full time as well, and decided to finally apply. I was also lucky to be accepted to a couple schools, and decided to accept an offer from Drew UCLA, which I'll be starting this summer.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alfonso Molina, and I went to the University of San Francisco for my undergrad, and I studied biology there. And then afterwards, like we were saying, I attended the UC Davis post-baccalaureate program, and I finished that last year in 2014. And I will also be attending UCLA Prime for medical school.
Hi everyone, my name is Romina Cifuentes, and I went to Los Angeles Pierce College for 2 years. And then after that, I transferred to UCLA, where I majored in biology. I graduated in 2010. After that, I've been working as a private tutor, and I took my MCAT last year, and I also applied last cycle, and I will be attending Loyola Research School of Medicine this fall.
Awesome, thank you everyone. So we'll start off with a basic overview of what the application cycle um, of our presentation. So we're going to go over the AMCAS application. We're going to hit some sections that we think are very important. Then we're going to go into secondaries, interviews, and finally, one of probably the most challenging parts of the AMCAS application is how to finance it. So the AMCAS application itself has 3 general steps to it. The first one, being the most obvious one, is submitting your application. But then there's a second part to it that's called the processing part, which for each person applying may vary depending on when you submitted your primary application and when your transcripts got there. So for someone like me, for example, I submitted my application uh, at the beginning of July, and it wasn't verified until the very end of July. So that application processing to verify your application, it differs for everyone. Lastly, there's the application delivery, which happens when your application is finally verified, then it is delivered to all the medical schools that you applied to. Would anyone else like to add something else to this part?
I think pretty much Leo mentioned everything in terms of the most difficult part really is preparing your application. And once it's processed, then you get more work done, right? The processing time is sort of your break because then your secondaries come in even during your break while they're processing your application. You should start working on your secondaries. So really, it's just three general steps, and it'll be a bit more clear as we go into our presentation.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide. So we just put this slide here with biography information, academics, and GPAs, just to keep in mind that to bring up some important dates that you should have in mind. And these dates kind of really don't change year by year. So these are the current dates for this cycle. You could have started your application May 5th, and you can actually submit your application as early as June 2nd. Again, like I mentioned, verification time after you submit differs from each applicant. So that's why it's kind of to your advantage to submit early and to make sure your transcripts are received by MCAS as soon as possible. So the sooner they get all that information, the sooner they can process your application and calculate your different GPAs and verify your application.
So I want to add on to that. When Leo says you can start your application on May 5th, I'm not sure if you mentioned it, but it's really just your basic information, like where you went to school, your parents' income, like biographical information.
Okay. So one part of the application is the disadvantage information. For me, I thought this was very important, especially for my case. So who is considered a disadvantaged student? Pretty much anyone that grew up in a medically underserved area that has insufficient resources. You can be socially, economically, and educationally disadvantaged, or just anything you feel was a obstacle for you. And on your application, you get a small paragraph to explain that. You get 1325 characters to explain why you should be considered a disadvantage. And medical schools use this information in various ways. Typically, what it leads to is a holistic review of your application. Like I mentioned, this was something very important for me because I felt that I had a lot of disadvantages socially, economically, and educationally. And it was important for me to be able to explain that to admissions, sorry, so that they can see that even though I had these challenges, I was able to overcome them and be a successful applicant and kind of demonstrate to them the type of doctor that I want to be using these disadvantages that I had. And 1300 characters sounds like a lot, but it's really not. So the hardest thing for me was having to condense everything into that small of amount in a form that was cohesive and in a form that was able to demonstrate the kind of doctor that I wanted to be.
So, Leo, I have a question for you. So, what do you think? Why would, or to any of our panelists, why would this be important for the admissions officers, like, to know this if you are disadvantaged? Why bother telling them? Why
Right,
would we even bother looking at that aspect of your application and factor in a different variable to consider giving you an interview? Like, why is this so important to the future of medicine and really to show your potential to be a physician leader, right?
right, exactly. So, based on traditional models of how students are selected for interviews, if you just consider a student's GPA or MCAT, that's not going to tell you the full story of an individual, especially someone who like me, who didn't have stellar stats. You really have to consider my overall package, my overall persona, what I bring to the table besides just those GPA and that MCAT. And especially because our communities need doctors that have these who have overcome these experiences, who know these experiences firsthand, because ultimately we're going to be seeing patients who have these disadvantages as well. Like I'll give you an example. One of my disadvantages was that while I was at UCLA, my father had a work accident and he was disabled, and so my family lost half our income during that time. This is something that's very real in our communities, especially for people who work in various laborious occupations. So I know firsthand how those situations affect your family dynamics, your educational outcomes. And as a person that was able to overcome that, I can, as a physician who's going to be treating and seeing these people in the community, I kind of know and understand their struggles because I actually experienced them. And medical schools need to know that so that they can see the potential that you bring to the table as a medical student.
Right, to contribute that diversity, right? Alfonso, do you want to share some of perhaps the disadvantages you have, or you as well, Romina, and perhaps also inform our attendees, how did you go about creating your disadvantage statement?
Yeah, I could. This is Alfonso. I could talk a little bit about my disadvantage application. Um, the way that I went about it, at first I wanted to I was told to always use like imagery with everything that I used when applying to medical school. And so I kind of took that approach. But after I sat down with a couple of mentors and other advisors, the disadvantage statement is actually kind of unique from your other application or other essays in your application because it's supposed to be kind of choppy. And what I mean by that is that you kind of want to be blunt and direct with your sentences, um, but at the same time have there be some flow to it. Um, and so what I did was I basically just listed everything. I started by thinking about my life growing up, where I grew up, describing the type of things that I would see, the types of resources that my family had to use, and then just talking about it and putting it in an organized way, kind of like a bullet point type of paragraph.
Do you want to add anything, Romina?
Yes, something that I want to add is make sure you have someone that can really look over um, this paragraph for you. I think sometimes we don't know that we might be disadvantaged, and also, like Alfonso said, maybe creating a list and having someone go over that list with you, and maybe trying to come up with more ideas because maybe like you might not think you're a disadvantaged student, but because of the situations, because something that happened in your life, you are, and it's really important to make sure to be concise with those in that paragraph because it's only 1325 characters, like Leo said. It might seem a lot, but really it's not. So I would really advise you to have someone read over this paragraph with you.
Right. So I just want to also add to let the attendees know some of my how I went about crafting my disadvantage statement. I think my first mistake that I made was really worrying about making this paragraph very eloquently and creatively, like writing it. But from the feedback that I got is, you don't want to waste time making like these really good transitions in your writing, because you want to list the disadvantages that you had, and sort of how did that change you, right? So for me, I'll give you an example. I went to public school in Los Angeles, LAUSD, and then I had the ability to go to magnet school. So I talked about that transition of going to lower performing schools and then these higher performing schools, and how I faced those challenges and the reasons why, because my parents didn't go to college, because they had a third grade education, so forth and so on. And I go into how I was, the first in my family to go to college as well, and how I struggled at UCLA because of lack of mentorship, right? So those are some of the disadvantages that I talked about, just to give you an idea that we all have diverse backgrounds. And again, just reiterating what Romina said, list things and then receive feedback on whether you should include it or not.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to move on to the next section of the application, which will be the experiences. And here you will include your work experiences, your extracurricular activities, any honors, awards, or publications. And the goal of this is really not to just write every detail of those experiences, but really try to paint a picture of your experience in your reader's mind, right? So one of the things, first, we're going to have a maximum of 15 experiences, and it'll be 700 characters. So now, how do we describe those experiences? So you will answer 4 questions: what, how, where, and why. The first one is, what did you do? So you should write a brief description of the organization and what's the role that you play there as well. And how long? Was this for only 2 weeks? Was this for a month? Was it a 3-year commitment? It's important to let the readers know about this. And also, where did it take place? Was it in a different country? Was it in a rural setting or urban setting? Was this an underserved community that perhaps it was mostly Spanish-speaking residents? So remember, the more of those details you incorporate, it creates imagery. And the most important question, and the question that you should probably focus most of your time with, is why was this significant to your growth and understanding of medicine? So how did maybe that experience help you decide that you want to do medicine as your profession, or that you want to do you want to work with underserved community, or that you want to address health disparities, or do you want to promote health equity? So all those things, it's important to mention that in that short paragraph. Does anyone else want to add something else with that?
Can our panelists also go into how did you decide, like how did you triage the labeling of your experiences? Maybe you have too many clinical, or you're trying to figure out if one of your experiences fit as research, or how did you incorporate conferences? And any of the panelists please elaborate on that?
Right, so I just want to say that it's very important how you're going to label your activities, right? Because you can classify them as leadership experience, or as extracurricular, or community service. So if you realize that you've had maybe too many leadership experiences, maybe one of them could also be a shadowing experience as well. So make sure that you have a well-balanced list of activities.
So I actually had that situation in my application. So I had a lot of leadership experiences, and I labeled them all as leadership instead of trying to balance them out and labeling them differently. So for example, I got feedback from UC Irvine with one application, and it wasn't clear to them my clinical experience. So even though I did have a lot of clinical experience, my clinical experience, I labeled it as leadership. And if I would have actually labeled it as clinical, and in the description part would have done a better job of explaining it as clinical, even though I did it as a leadership position, both would have been evident. But it's something that I didn't do, and it made it harder for admissions to kind of grade me on that. So definitely keep an eye out for that. Try to get a balanced balance out the question as far as your experiences.
I wanted to add something as far as the research in question. You know, some medical schools are very focused on research. They want to see that in your experiences you have done some form of research, right? So for myself, I did the Harvard UCLA Suburban Health Fellowship. I'm not sure if some of you are familiar with it or not. It was only about maybe about 6 weeks during the summer, and we did do research, a research project, and I labeled it. That was my research experience, and then also molecular cell and developmental biology class that I took at UCLA, 10-week course that where we conducted our own research. Although it was not long term, I still label it a research because my perspective was that these experiences helped me develop critical thinking skills that I can really apply to anything, whether that was my community outreach or my future research that I would want to do in medical school. And so, for instance, when I interviewed at Irvine, they were told, and I asked, well, I'm not sure if I have enough research, right? But they're like, oh, that's something that you don't need to worry about because you label these experiences and you showed how it helped you. So
Right.
another example about labeling and really getting that feedback.
Yes,
And,
that's correct.
and if I can add something as well, this is all about the experiences. You also kind of like we were saying earlier, you want to paint a story about you. So you consider about how you're presenting yourself. For example, if you want to demonstrate to the committees that you're somebody who's resilient, well, in your experiences, this is where they're going to see that. In addition to your personal statement, of course, but also your experiences. So what I did for mine was from freshman year, I was a student that took some time to adjust to school, to undergrad. Um, I lacked mentorship as well, so it took me a while to figure things out. And so, for my experiences during my freshman year, I talked about what I was doing to cope with it. So I included when I played for the club soccer team, and I said, well, this is how I managed my stress during the time, and also like talked about other stuff that I came from that. But that was really like the core of that experience was that this is how I was keeping my sanity, during this difficult time when everything was kind of going bad. Um, so kind of building off that in each experience. So this is how I manage my stress, and then in this next experience, I developed this skill, maybe critical thinking, and then I did this experience and I developed time management skills, and just painting a picture of how you've developed over the years.
I completely
Right.
agree
Make
with
sure when
Alfonso.
you,
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Romina.
no problem. So make sure when you write these experiences that you always try to bring it back to medicine, even if that experience has nothing to do with medicine, right? But those skills that you acquire when you did that activity will help you when you become a doctor or will help you in medical school as well. And something that I wanted to mention with the word limit, it's 700 characters. And something that helped me out a lot was using active verbs when I wrote my description. So make sure, so let's say you are a volunteer at a free clinic, right? So how I wrote it was I volunteer at this free clinic, right? Do not say like I was volunteering because that adds more characters. So just make sure you are very concise and to the point when it comes to writing this paragraph.
I agree, Romina, with the whole being concise. Because with the question that she said, you have to answer the questions, the what, how, and where. For me, my goal was to try to condense that into one sentence. And then I would focus the majority of my characters into the why and how did I grow. And that's the challenging part of writing these experiences. How do you make it concise so that the majority of your writing is focused on the why and painting that imagery? Maybe sharing an anecdote of some club that you were in and or a health fair that you participated in.
Yeah, and the admissions committee still know exactly what it is that the experience, like what the experience is. For
Or
example,
can
if you say I shadowed a doctor. Like you don't have to say I shadowed the head of neurosurgery at UCLA. You can just say I shadowed a doctor because the important thing is what you learned, the why. What did you learn from the experience and how did you change? That's what they want to know.
is there any questions for this section?
Okay, so let's move on to the next slide.
I just want to remind our attendees if you have any questions or if you don't want to type it in or rather verbalize it, you can just use the hand feature and then I can go ahead and unmute you and you can go ahead and ask your question.
I think there's a question actually. Um, one of the attendees asked, do you write your experiences in paragraph form for each or in bullet points?
So I can go ahead and answer
So I
that.
wrote it in, you do not have the, okay, go ahead.
I wrote it in paragraphs, not necessarily bullet points. Really, pretty much every medical student that I talked to and have come across, and even my peers have done paragraph form. Because if you're trying to show how you grew and how really it's helping you become a better physician or better, be more empathetic, have more compassion, it's kind of hard to convey that in a bullet point and create imagery. That's my take on it.
Yeah, same here. I did paragraphs, and just to emphasize how important the experiences are, I spent as much time working on my experiences as I did for my personal statement.
Yeah, it's the same here. I also did it in a paragraph form. You do not have the option to do it like in bullet points. So I did it in paragraph as well. So I think we should move on to the next slide. Okay, great. So now after you have completed your 15 experiences, 3 out of those you will designate them as the most meaningful experiences. And here you will write 3 additional short responses, and the word limit is 1325 characters. So when it comes to this section, how do I identify those 3 experiences? So how I saw it is, what experience really made an impact in my pre-medical journey, right? What put a mark? What experience really opened my eyes the most? So for example, maybe there were mentors in a certain program that I was part of, and they told me how I've changed, or so many skills that I've acquired from the first day I participated in that program to the last day. So maybe that would be a good idea for you to mention that specific program as the most meaningful experience. Um, Also, another thing you can also focus is the transformative nature before and after. So what kind of student were you before you did the program, and what kind of student were you afterwards? So for example, when I was in UCLA, I was part of CCM, which is a pre-health organization. It's called Chicanos Latinos for Community Medicine. And I remember after graduating from UCLA thinking how really through CCM, I was able to develop a greater sense of community responsibility and how I really wanted to address health disparities. And I remember going to the free health fairs and seeing the volunteer physicians there and how they do the health assessment of the attendees, but they also address their social circumstances. And I want to be that kind of physician that doesn't only look at what's physiologically wrong with the patient, but also addresses their health needs, their social needs. So that's something you can also mention when it comes to writing your most meaningful experiences, how maybe a certain experience made you want to be a certain kind of physician. And also feel free to write the skills you have acquired and how those skills those skills you will use them in your medical profession as well. Does anyone else want to add?
Yes, I want to add. How do
We
you go
all
about?
share like one of our
I wanted to focus on the writing aspect. How do you really decide? What do you? So let me step back a bit. So for the most meaningful experiences, you get 2 boxes where you can write. And one of them, I forgot the character count, but it's smaller. And then you have a big bulk where you can write some more, right? And what I try to do is in the first portion, I focus mainly on the what, where, how long, and then in the last section where you get the most amount of characters, the second box, I focus on the transformative nature and the personal growth. So that's how I approached writing the most meaningful experiences.
Right. So in the previous experiences where you only get 700 characters, you can talk about those questions like the what, where, how long, and why. But the why could be, maybe a little shorter. And in the most meaningful experience, you can write an anecdote, something that maybe an experience with a certain patient when you were shadowing. So that's how you can go about writing that section.
Yeah, I definitely approach my three most meaningful experiences as the type of doctor that I envision becoming. So, I in my why, explaining those 300 and this 1325 characters, I really talked about how the stuff that I've learned are going to help me not only in medical school, but as a physician I will ultimately become.
Anyone else want to add something else?
So next slide.
Yes.
Okay.
We go back to the slide and just have the
Sure.
panelists share some of the most meaningful experiences, and I can start off first. So for me, one of them was my post-bac experience. My second one was my clinical experience at Venice Family Clinic because I had done it for 3 years. And then my position as internal for CCM because really that was my final position and the most demanding one that I've had for this organization. And that was my third year being on the board of directors. Just so that the attendees get an idea of the types of things we wrote about for our most meaningful experiences.
Yes, so my three most meaningful experiences was being coordinator for Harvard UCLA Summer Urban Health Fellowship. It was also being a mentor coordinator for STOMP, which is a organization that helps transfer students at UCLA. And my last one was being a volunteer at the Free Clinic of Simi Valley.
Hi, this is Alfonso. My experiences were my first one was I did the summer medical and dental education program at UCLA, and so I talked about that because that was very important. It was really like a pivotal moment in my life because that's really where I learned how to study and gain a lot of academic skills, test-taking strategies, and my second one was my research experience. I did undergraduate research. I did research with foster youth, so it was like qualitative research, um, and I talked about that. And I also talked about like Gabby, my post-bac experience at UC Davis, and I chose those because they demonstrated the type of student that I am, and really the transformative nature as we've been discussing.
So this is Leo. My first one was about CCM at UCLA. I was a board member for 3 years, and CCM, as the first person in my family to go to college and try to pursue a career in medicine, I felt CCM is a huge part of that success that I have right now. My second one was I was director of the Latino Student Health Project again for 3 years, and through that position, I was able to provide healthcare and healthcare education to underserved communities in California and Mexico. And so that was really important for me, and it was kind of the doctor that I envisioned myself becoming. So that was my second one. And my last one, I've been doing research for 9 years now, and I I still that's what I do right now. I do research at UCLA on muscular dystrophy, and that was definitely a transformative nature for me because I came into the lab as a dishwasher, and now I have 6 publications, and it kind of shows the type of doctor and the kind of resilience I have as a medical student and as a doctor that I will become.
Okay, Leo, I'm going to go ahead and take the time to answer a couple of questions that we have. Catherine mentioned if we have a disadvantage statement, would we be willing to give feedback? So I answered her. I'm not sure everyone received my reply, but I said that at the end of the presentation, we would be providing our contact information. And you are more than, I mean, I'm sure I'm not speaking for myself, but all the panelists, would be willing to provide that feedback. If you want to see look it over, you're going to have our access to our email address at the end of the presentation. Andrea mentioned that she's having trouble hearing Alfonso. His signal cuts off a bit. Um,
Yeah,
I think it's the
the
internet
same.
connection.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's some of the issues, with webinars and the web. But if Alfonso, if he ends up cutting off, maybe he can just send everyone maybe a message through chat or something. We'll figure it out as we go along. Leo, we
So
can go.
do I move on?
Yeah, we can move on.
Okay.
Does Alfonso want to continue with the personal statement slide?
Gabby, do you want to?
Okay, so with the personal statement, that I think this is one of the most challenging pieces of writing that requires the most amount of work, I would say. How early you should start? I think that's really based on your own timeline. Because see, for myself, I had to study for the MCAT and then wait for my score, and then I started working on it because I didn't have time when I was studying for my MCAT. Although I had some drafts written already, so for me, I did it in a shorter timeline. But it wasn't like I was starting from a clean slate. I already had statements written, not necessarily my final one. So again, the personal statement, you really want to focus on why do you want to be a doctor? It's your time to reflect, maybe share an anecdote, go through your process of how you decided you wanted to be a doctor. That's sort of the approach I took, and everyone takes a different approach. So for me, I started how I first thought about medicine, and that was through a high school program. And then I went into how to UCLA, that was solidified. And I decided to focus on some of the experiences I encountered while I was an undergraduate at UCLA and the projects that I volunteered in. And really, how those experiences helped me grow and gave me a perspective of what I wanted to do in medicine. And then I shared with the admissions officers my vision for medicine in my personal statement and sort of how my vision developed to use medicine as a tool for social justice. Who helped me with editing? It was a medical student mentor and then a couple physician mentors. I didn't necessarily use a writing specialist because my timeline was shorter, but I would highly recommend it. A writing specialist is good because they focus on the grammar and the technical aspects of writing. And then usually your physician mentor or peer mentor will focus more on, is this you? Is this personal statement reflective of you? Are you getting your imagery across? Are you allowing them to really understand why do you want to be a doctor? And at the end, with the end product, really it's what you're comfortable with. So you're going to get advice from everyone that reads it, and you might not agree with it. You might think the sentence that I wrote in the beginning, I want to keep it. And if that's what makes you satisfied and you think it shows why you want to be a doctor, then you need to be comfortable keeping it. So always know that you have the ability to take feedback and then sort of let some feedback go that doesn't really help you. Does anyone else from the panelists want to add something to the personal statement? I know it's sort of maybe add how you went about your brainstorming process.
I'll add one thing. I'll say don't be afraid of being repetitive. Like if, for example, if you mention something in your experiences, but it's central and crucial to the type of doctor that you want to be, you can still talk about it in your personal statement. At least I did. For example, I did mention that I was a director of the Latino Student Health Project at UCLA. I did it as my most meaningful experiences, and I also talked about it in my personal statement. The same goes with my research. I did it as my most meaningful experience, but I also included it in my personal statement
Leo,
because to me those things are central to the type of doctor that I.
Leo, I have a
Yes,
question for you since you mentioned that because I did that as well. But did you focus on the same things that you wrote about in your most meaningful experiences section, or did you bring something up different about that situation in your personal statement?
absolutely. I brought in something completely different, not different. I mean, I brought in completely different examples and different roles within those same experiences and different outcomes
So I hope
that contribute
that's
to a
right.
vision that I.
I hope that's clear to our attendees, really, that you can use, let's say, you in your most meaningful experiences, you use a clinical experience, but then that clinical experience is integral to you choosing to be a doctor. Don't be afraid to use it in your personal statement. Use it, but maybe share a different story that you encountered or a different challenge you faced. Romina, do you want to add anything to the personal statement?
I'll add one more thing. So I know it's a personal statement, and you should. Sometimes we share sensitive information, but whatever you share on there, it's pretty much fair game for discussions with admissions. So be comfortable talking about it.
Yes. Sorry, guys, I was muted. I thought I was unmuted. Anyway, so when I was writing my personal statement, I did a lot of brainstorming. So I thought about different anecdotes that I had maybe with patients or anecdotes that I had as a mentor when I was mentoring a lot of transfer students. So I think when I wrote my personal statement, that's how I started the opening paragraph with an experience that I had with a patient when I was volunteering. I think it really paints a picture for the reader, and it grabs their attention as well. And like Leo and Gabby said, do not be afraid to mention your same experience, in your personal statement that you included as one of your 15 experiences. That's totally okay. Everyone does that, but make sure you incorporate a new anecdote. You don't want to sound repetitive.
Hi, this is Alfonso. Hopefully the connection is a bit better. Um, the way that I went about doing my personal statement was just taking the time. I took a long time actually writing it because, like I mentioned, I applied to a post-bac program. So the essay that I used to apply for the post-bac program was basically the skeleton that I used for writing my personal statement for medical school. And I put a lot of time into that. So I would say probably like two months for that, and then started like in March, um, writing my personal statement for medical school, which I ended up submitting in July. So like 4 more months on top of that. But it was like just like 30 minutes every now and then, an hour every now and then. Really, when I was just thinking about it all the time, like what kind of characteristics do I want to show them? What kind of experiences do I want to tell them about? So just thinking about it all the time. And then I would get home and I would say, oh yeah, that was a good thought, and just write it down. And then later on, develop that thought, and then just let it sit for a while, and then continue to develop it. Um, but that's how I went about it, and I essentially just told them my story, who I was from. I wrote down an autobiography about myself, which I would recommend doing. Just sitting down and you know pretending that you're writing your life story. And I was born this day in this hospital, and this is how I thought as a kid, and this is what I wanted to do. And slowly you'll start to see, oh wow, like this was all always kind of leading towards medicine, or maybe it's something different for everyone else. But you'll start to see the highlights of your life that made you want to pursue a career in medicine. And that's how I went about doing it.
And something that I want to add is I want to reiterate how the importance of having someone or multiple people edit your personal statement. I remember when I wrote mine, I think I had 10 drafts, and but my mentors really wanted me to reflect for that personal statement to reflect who I was, how what kind of physician I'm gonna be, and also my struggles that I had in my life. So I just want to make sure that you reach out to those mentors, medical students, physician mentors, or just someone that really knows you to make sure that that personal statement reflects who you are.
Any questions?
I think we can move on to the next slide.
Okay.
All right, so now we'll have the section of letters of recommendation. And this is where you'll be able to designate your letters to the medical schools. And one important thing that I always thought about is what are medical schools looking for in terms of LORs, right? So what do they want? So they will really like your letter writer to give any new insight about you as an applicant, right? They want to get to know your character. So let's say they want to see how, if you're ready for the rigor of medical school, if you're motivated about medicine, or have you done any independent work, right? All those things will really give new insight about you. So now, I'm sure a lot of you have heard that we all want a strong LOR, right? But how do we do this? The best way to do this is by establishing a relationship with your letter writer. So for example, if you need a letter recommendation from one of your professors, so the first thing to do is start by going to office hours and just share with them your goals. What is it that you want to do? What kind of position you want to do? That you want to go to medical school, and maybe that you want to do research as well. So tell them why is it that you like their class so much? Why have they inspired you? And why do you want them to write you a letter recommendation? I think I was able to do these things, and I was able to get a strong letter of recommendation because they knew who I was as a person and as a student. So they didn't just only write how I got an A in my class, but they got to write about my qualities and experiences with me. So next question is, how many LORs do I ask for, right? So most medical schools will ask for a minimum of 3 letters, so 2 sciences and 1 non-science. But this varies by school. You know, some of them they accept more letters, or I think most of them will say it's 3. So I asked for 7 letters of recommendations. I had 2 sciences, 1 non-science, 2 extracurricular activities, 1 research, and 1 shadowing experience. But like I said, I did not send all those letters to every medical school. You know, you have to make sure you look at their requirements. Another thing that I want to mention is, you know, these letter writers are very busy, but they have written many of these letters, and it's just to your advantage to give them enough time for them to write a good letter for you. So I would suggest at least a month so they can work on your letter recommendation. Does anyone have any questions so far, or does one of the panelists want to add something else?
I would want to add something. So for my letters of recommendation, I gave them a packet. I included my personal statement and autobiography, and I also told them what I wanted them to focus on. So for instance, my faculty advisor for CCM, I asked him to focus on different things than my biochemistry teacher. For my biochemistry teacher, I wanted to focus more on my growth in the class and how she saw me really begin to understand the concepts more and how inquisitive I was during office hours. That's one aspect that I want to add. And the other aspect is you should use a letter forwarding service such as Interfolio so that your letter writers can submit it online, and then from this online database, which you can't see the letters on, they can send it to MCAS, and then you send it to the schools. So if you have any questions about that process, it might sound a bit confusing since you haven't started your application cycle yet, or if you haven't looked into it, feel free to ask a question regarding that. As far as when you need your letters of recommendation, that's important to know, because when I started this process, I thought, oh, shoot, do I need them right when I'm going to submit my primary? Well, you don't. You actually need them around the time where you're doing secondaries. And each school has a different deadline when you can submit your letters of recommendation. Some of them are even after you submit your secondaries. So that's important to keep in mind because it gives you more time to give to your letter writers, or gives you more time to see who you want to ask. Does any other panelist want to add something, Leo or Alfonso?
Yeah, I want to add something. As far as who you're asking for your letters of rec, uh, make sure that ultimately whoever you ask is gonna write a strong letter for you. I know in my case, I had only one professor write a letter for me, and I actually only ran into trouble with one school because of that. I think it was the University of Illinois. I couldn't actually apply to that school because they required 2 letters of recommendations from professors that actually gave you a letter grade. So I couldn't do that because I didn't have that letter. but I chose people who knew me very well and who without me giving them information knew me, who could write a strong letter for me. And so if you had the option of choosing between a professor that gave you a grade or someone that knows you very well, I would definitely go with that person that knows you very well.
I wanna
Right. Go ahead, Alfonso, sorry.
thank you. I just wanted to add, in addition to what Leo was saying, that yeah, you want to pick somebody that knows you very well as well, and hopefully that also aligns with the person responsible for your meaningful experience. Because if it's a meaningful experience, if you report it as a meaningful experience, the medical schools are going to expect you to have a letter of recommendation, kind of to validate that that it was a meaningful experience. Because if it was meaningful, then they assume that you got to know the person very well, and they would want to see a letter.
Yes, I totally agree with you, Alfonso. So for those three meaningful experiences that I had a letter for each one of them as well, because like you said, they want us, if it's meaningful, then it's very likely that you're gonna ask um, the person in charge for a letter. And also for another thing that I want to add is that let's say you didn't know your professor as much, but you had a good relationship with your TA. It's fine to also ask letters from your TA. I actually did that for one of my classes, and they both co-signed it. So it was signed by both my TA and my professor. So if anyone doesn't, if there's no more questions, or
I think we have a
there's the
question.
one question.
Yes,
Does it
someone
make a difference?
asks, okay.
Yeah.
Does it make a difference if a professor is full-time or part-time faculty? From my experience, my biochemistry teacher from UCLA that wrote my letter of recommendation, she didn't conduct research. She was just a lecturer, and I used her letter of recommendation, and I had no problems. Didn't have any problems getting into medical school, so I don't think that that's an issue. And I want to just elaborate on one more thing, and then we can go ahead and move on getting letters of recommendation for your three most meaningful experiences. For some schools, if you remember or not, I mentioned I used my post-bac experience, CCM, and then my VFC clinical experience. So for some schools, I didn't use my post-bac letter recommendation because they had a restriction on the number of letters of recommendation that I could send. So therefore, for some of them, I didn't use it. I was strategic on the ones that I wanted to send. So in my case, some schools didn't receive letters of recommendation for my most meaningful experiences, and it was okay. So that's where I would say I had a different experience. And I didn't have a letter of recommendation for my Venice Family Clinic clinical experience because the director of the volunteer services sort of had left, and I didn't really keep in contact with him, and I had no problems because during my interview and in my writing pieces, they were able to see that stuff I talked about was really genuine and I lived it, right? So those are some things to keep in mind from my perspective.
Okay, so we're gonna move on to the next slide. So after you have contacted your letter writers, so now what do we do, right? So the best way will be to prepare a folder for them. I turn in my folder personally, and this included the personal statement you turn into AMCAS, your CV, a copy of your transcripts. So if you went to multiple schools, I've had all of those transcripts, and also an AMCAS cover letter for each of your letters of recommendation, and this you will be able to get from your application, and also detailed instructions. So if you want them to mail them, provide them with the address, or provide them with the link of where you want them to upload your letter. And last, provide them with an envelope or stamp if necessary. Remember, you just want to make it as easy as possible for them, to submit your letter. They are very busy and they could forget things, but it's important for you to remember that. Make sure you send follow-up emails as well. It is okay to do that. I'm sure they will welcome that. And after AMCAS has received all of your letters, send them a thank you card or thank you email, letting them know how important they were in your application journey and how you appreciate their time. So I make sure, and also after now that I've been accepted to medical school, I've reached out to my letter writers and let them know I was accepted to this school. And thank you so much for writing my letter, because I know it was a huge part in me getting accepted to medical school. Does any of the panelists want to add anything else?
Romina,
I
moving
think,
ahead,
yeah,
and we have a question that pertains to letters of recommendation before we move away from the subject,
Okay.
from Catherine. So she has a hand raised, and she's also asking, I've heard mixed reviews about getting letters of recommendation from a physician you shadowed. What are your opinions? So I'll go ahead and unmute Catherine so she can ask her question. Okay, Catherine, can you go ahead
Hi.
and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I've just heard mixed reviews on the whole topic of getting a letter from like a physician that you shadowed for like a while. They're like, well, all doctors are nice. They're all gonna know. They're gonna say nice things about you, and really, you shadowed. Like, um, I'm just not sure if because I have one. I don't know if it's even worth like submitting or making it part of like the package of letters that you send in. So I yeah.
I think I can answer that. Um, I think that it just depends as well. So, for example, if it's only a letter because it's just an extra letter from a doctor, then I wouldn't recommend using it unless you have a really good relationship with them. It's always great to have a doctor though a letter on your behalf because they're going to say things like, "This is somebody who our community needs," and they might even go as far as saying, "This is somebody who I would trust my family going to."
Hmm.
I think that says a lot because they are obviously in the field already and they know what is needed, what needs to change. So when they can speak on your behalf, it's going to look very good. But I also want to go back to the first point that I was trying to say. It's better to have three strong letters of recommendation than have a total of five letters of recommendation and only having three of those be strong. So having two average letters might, it might balance out your strong letters and it might question them. It might cause doubt on the admissions committee. Versus if they only had three strong letters, that's the image that would be left about you. Um, so I would recommend that you take that into consideration as well.
Okay, thank you.
Just going back to your question, Catherine, I did have a letter of recommendation from a physician I shadow, but you kind of have to make sure that the physician really does know you, that they have seen skills in you, that they're like, oh, she'll be a great doctor because of this and that. You just don't want to get a letter just because he is a physician. So I think even before you ask him for a letter, just talk to him, maybe what skills he has seen in you, so that kind of reassures you that you will have a strong letter.
Hmm. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Does anyone else want to add when it comes to preparing a folder?
I'll add something else. So besides a folder, I also prepared a PowerPoint about myself to my letter of rec writers, and I put it in a flash drive that was a kind of a gift to them as well. So I just think images for me speak more than words sometimes. So in that PowerPoint, I talked about, my most meaningful experiences, and just kind of give him a more intimate look at who I am. And I thought that was something pretty cool. Someone told me about it, and my letter of rec writers really liked that. And I also use Interfolio to make life for them a lot easier.
I want to
Mhm.
add on the
Right, you
interfolio.
can.
Another reason why the interfolio I think is very important is because the letters are saved. So let's say you decide to apply for a scholarship after your application, like once you're interviewing, like to help finance your application process. You can ask them if they can modify it and it's saved on there. Or you can just automatically have Interfolio send it to, let's say, a scholarship committee or something. So I would really highly recommend Interfolio. And
Yeah,
in
and you
your
can definitely
packet,
use.
right? And in your packet, you could include your information for Interfolio. because your recommender might not be too familiar. You just want to make it as easy as possible for them.
Yeah, and also you can also use your school's letter service, so that's also available for you guys if you're still an undergraduate.
And for those that don't want to use Interfolio, I personally didn't use Interfolio, just because I really didn't want to spend the money, and I actually ended up not needing it because some of the schools that I applied to actually advised or only accepted letters from MCAS. So I didn't have a problem. So I just want you guys to know that you don't have to use the service, but it is highly recommended to use it.
All right, so I guess we can move on to the next slide.
Okay, so
Wanna
for
take the lead on this one, Gabby?
okay, yeah. So for choosing your schools, and I'll also let have some time at the end to have the panelists add to it because I know some of them have a more strategic way of choosing schools. That's something that I could have done a better job on, but didn't really do because of decisions I made throughout my process. But the first thing is you want to choose it strategically. You want to apply to a variety of schools. So that might be having some reach schools, having some schools that you know you have a better chance of getting into, and then to some schools that maybe have a better record of accepting underrepresented students that are out of state. So you have to be strategic, being honest with yourself, right, of where your faults are and where your strengths are. And I mentioned in the PowerPoint, keeping in mind your budget, because for each school, if you don't have FAP, right, you're gonna have to perhaps pay for your secondary, even pay for the primary fee as well, and even a fly out for interviews. To For a lot of miscellaneous costs are associated with the number of schools you decide to apply to. And then as far as well, where do you find this sort of information to choose which school to apply to? Right, the MSAR is a good source, and they have a lot of admissions details. And with admissions details, I mean such things such as the range of MCAT scores that they accept, GPA range, their like average GPA for their accepted students, whether they accept out of state students, like the percentage of in-state versus out of state interviews that are granted. And some schools don't even interview out of state applicants, so then you would know not to apply there. And that's all in the MSAR. And then recommendations from previous applicants and mentors. So maybe you have a, a colleague who's now in medical school and they tell you, I had a really great experience at this medical school, make sure to apply there because they told me that they want, for instance, let's say more students from California going to their school. Or for instance, when I interviewed at UW, they interviewed a very small amount of out-of-state applicants, but they told us that the reason why we were being interviewed, despite being out of state, was because our main focus was using medicine to advocate for underserved communities. So therefore, that's why we were interviewed. So that's something that's aligned with you. Then you have a pretty good shot of getting an interview at UW despite being an out-of-state applicant. And see, you would get that recommendation from a student like myself who's not going to medical school or a physician mentor. Romina, can you go a bit into how you decided to choose your schools based on GPA and MCAT? I remember you mentioning that to me.
Mina?
She might be having technical problems, but Leo, you can add something, or
I'm
Alfonso.
sorry.
Oh, okay.
Sorry,
I think
guys.
she's back.
All right, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So what I did when it comes to choosing medical school, I wanted to make sure that I did it based on GPA and also MCAT scores. So my situation was that I did have more of a higher GPA, but not more of an average MCAT score. So I wanted to make sure that the schools I applied to were going to be okay with my MCAT score. So when I came to using the MSAR, I really looked through each of the medical schools and looked at what are their average scores for GPA and for the MCAT. That's another thing that I focused on was looking at, like Gabby said, certain schools will not accept out-of-state students. So make sure you do not miss that and you don't apply to that school, because that will be, you don't want to waste any more, money. It's really expensive applying to medical schools. So you want to make sure you look at those details when it comes to choosing your schools. And another thing was looking at location. If you don't want to go to a state that's it's really cold during the winter, I would suggest don't apply there. But if you're willing to go to another state, and that's definitely fine. I got into Chicago, and I want to make sure that I'm gonna feel happy there and that I'm gonna be okay with the weather. So I would suggest you taking those things into consideration as well.
I
Is there any
want
question from
I
the
want to
attendees?
add something about choosing medical schools. I think a mistake that I made was unrealistically applying to too many schools, because when I received secondaries, I took a risk because I didn't complete 10 secondaries. I really asked myself, do I see myself, for instance, going to Arizona, for example, for medical school? And I couldn't answer certain questions that the medical schools would ask as to why I was choosing their school. So I decided, not to complete the secondary process for many schools. And I could have saved myself money if I didn't apply to them to begin with. And I mean, someone could say that was risky because I'm decreasing my odds. I decreased my odds of gaining acceptance. But I mean, I should have just been more confident with that decision earlier on.
Yeah, and as we'll discuss in the next upcoming slides, it gets pretty overwhelming with secondaries. So I applied to 26 schools, but I just ran out of time. Like, and I just thought about it. Like, do I really want to go to this school? Because secondaries kind of has like a really very big work, and I really only applied about 18 of them.
Okay, so I think we'll move on to the next slide. I think this is a good transition.
So now we're going to talk about the secondary applications. So this is going to come after primary application, and after they have read your personal statement and have decided to they decided that they want to know more about you, or other schools will just give it to everyone. It just depends. So I tended to focus on the ones that actually took the time to screen and select certain applicants. So I worked on those first, and I worked on the the ones that gave it to everybody after I finished those. And so one of the things that I would recommend is you can start on your secondaries at any time. It's true that you might not receive a secondary from a school that's not that actually selects their secondary recipients, but what if you are one of those people? Then it's better to get a head start, and it might provide some content for a different question. So there's this website. I'm not sure if everyone it's called Student Doctor Network. That's the SDN, Student Doctor Network, and there you can find previous year's application questions. And it's just like a forum where people who are applying just give their insights, like, hey, I spoke to a or I heard this. Does anybody recommend this? And so on. But the most important is actual question for you, and that'll give you a good start. One of the ones that I would recommend starting with is the UC San Diego one, just because, especially if you're having trouble with your personal statement, because that question is an autobiography. So they want you to tell them about yourself in, I think, like 5,000 characters. So it's kind of like your personal statement, but they want you to use something other than your personal statement. So for UCSD, you're essentially going to write 2 personal statements. And yeah, because it's starting like that because it provides you like a framework to go on and answer other questions. Once you have your life laid out, you can just pick and choose, and then that'll be your foundation to start the next question. And I would really, really recommend forming a relationship with your writing specialist. If you're in school still, ask them, hey, I'm going to be applying to medical school this summer, and I would really appreciate it if I could, rely on your services. Of course, you're going to schedule appointments, but just give them a heads up. Like, I'm going to be coming in probably every other day. So if you could help me out, or what would you recommend me doing? Or maybe you guys have some friends who are very good with grammar, because you definitely want to submit within 2 weeks. But hey, I didn't submit all my secondaries in 2 weeks, and I still got interviews at some schools. So that rule isn't always 100%. A mentor that I had says that if they like you, they'll find you. They'll find you. It doesn't matter how long you wait to submit, but for the most part, you want to submit within 2 weeks. And that can get pretty overwhelming when you have multiple secondaries coming in every day or every week.
I want to add something to that,
Does
Alfonso.
anyone have anything else?
I want to add as far as how much editing, how much finalizing do you do to these secondaries? For me, as we'll go into a bit later, we'll share our own personal timelines. I submitted my application later in the cycle, so I had less time to work on my secondaries, right, before I started receiving them. So I couldn't spend so much time editing. And my mentor, what he told me, a physician mentor, he said, don't dwell on it too much. Don't try to perfect it too much. Just get your point across. Make sure there's no spelling errors, grammar mistakes, like obvious mistakes, and submit it. So just so you have an idea. And again, like Alfonso mentioned, I didn't, for some schools, I took a bit longer than 2 weeks because I was working while doing my secondaries, and it makes everything more difficult. Another aspect that I use is I saved my secondaries for each school, and then I would cut and paste and use different sentences here and there from what I had already written. That saved time as well. And also, I would suggest keeping track of
I
the
believe we have a
dates.
question.
Okay, well, let me just finish and then we'll go ahead and answer it. And then I also kept track of the secondaries. I tried at least through an Excel, but I would highly recommend it because I did miss one deadline for UCSD because I just had too many secondaries. And some schools, they have hard deadlines. They tell you within 2 weeks you need to submit it, or 3 weeks. And if you don't submit it, you can't turn it in anymore unless you ask them for an extension. So I would highly suggest you keep track of the due dates and secondaries you have to complete and those that you've completed already.
I think there was a question.
Okay, the question is, how do you know which schools send secondaries to applicants or which ones screen? Edith asked this question. For me, I knew because people told me, but I'm not sure if one of the panelists can say if the MSAR has it or not.
It does
Yes,
have
the
it.
MSAR has it.
Okay.
For sure, all the UCs screen, and then you can look up at other school that on the MSAR. There'll be a section for it. So the MSAR is actually a great investment, I think, personally.
So now we're going to move into the types of interviews. So most schools are switching to an MMI format, which is a multi-mini interview. And for those that don't know what this is that it depends on the school. Most schools there's usually about 6 or 7 to even 12 rooms, so like clinical rooms, and you walk in and there's a standardized patient or actor, and there's another person who's grading you, and you're supposed to just pretend like that person's not there. And then some schools even have cameras to record the event or to feed back to another room with people, admissions people looking at it. And basically, they just ask you or present you with different scenarios that you have to tackle in. You have 2 minutes to read the prompt and kind of formulate a response, and then you walk in, and these can be from like team building exercises to ethical questions to they want you to teach them something. It just depends on the school. Um, and this is actually kind of beneficial because you're with an average of 10 different people who are reviewing you as an applicant. And so if you mess up on one of them, then you have the opportunity to really step it up at the next station. And you just rotate like that throughout the interview. And they usually last between, I think, like 8 to 10 minutes in length. So you have 2 minutes to read, and the remaining time to actually answer the question or perform the scenario. Um, but then on the other side, you have the traditional interviews. So some schools are still doing traditional interviews, and what we mean by traditional is that you'll sit with another person of the admissions committee, usually one of the faculty or one of the professors or a medical student in their fourth year. Um, and they just talk to you and they ask you those questions like what are your weaknesses and all those questions that you can tell you the truth, you can prepare for those versus the MMI where you can prepare in a certain way, and we'll talk about that in the next bullet point, but you essentially can't. And then I don't know too much about the panels, so I'll let somebody else from this panel talk about it because I never had that interview. So I'll just move on to trying to incorporate the following topics into your responses for an MMI specifically, because like I mentioned, the MMI you have to find a way to really share yourself during that interview, because you can get a question that has nothing to do with you. It could literally just be like, hey, make this person, talk to this person about their problem that they're having. So you can't really say much about you other than perform the task. And so it's important that you have some type of strategy. So the strategy that I used was I would always try to incorporate, why do I want to be a doctor? In every question that was asked of me, no matter how random it was, somehow I tied it back to why I wanted to be a doctor. And then I talked about a life experience that was related to the question. And then by future goals and benefits, I just mean how has that life experience that I used, how has that contributed to the person that I am today, and how is that going to benefit the school by accepting me, and how is that going to make me a better doctor in the end. So, for example, if you were to ask the question, why is the sky blue? So something like that, like it could be something random like that, but the way that I would answer it is I would be like, growing up, as a kid, I would, always be curious about different things, such as the sky being blue, and then I went into undergrad and I started thinking about physics and learning about all these other wavelengths and components like that, and then talk about an experience, and then basically talk about how that benefited me from as a doctor, how that's going to benefit me as a doctor, because I'm curious and I'm willing to learn new things, and so you want to paint a picture about yourself in every question, in every room, and that'll make you really stand out to the admissions committee, because most people are going to be answering the question versus you who is answering the question and is sharing something about you. So it'll stick, because a lot of people have the same question since it's a standard. The same response since it's a standardized question. Does somebody want to talk about the panel?
Sure. I'll talk about my one experience with the panel. It was at the UW in Seattle. It was composed of three people: a faculty physician, a community physician, and a medical student. And only the faculty physician had access to in my entire application. The student and the community physician only had access to my written statement, so they didn't have my GPA or MCAT. And really, it was like a traditional interview. They just, personally for me, they just took turns asking questions. So they went into like, tell me about yourself, and then into, they asked me about different scenarios that I had encountered, like share a clinical experience, or they gave me a scenario. So it wasn't very different. It was just more people. That was my experience with the panel.
Something that I wanted to mention with traditional interviews is that when it comes to this kind of interviews, this more personal questions like tell us about a weakness or a strength, or why do you want to be a doctor, or tell us about your an experience you've had with maybe with a doctor or with a physician, right? But with MMI, you can be asked questions more about like ethical scenarios, or tell us pros and cons. It's very different when it comes to preparing for those two types of interviews. So for traditional, it's I definitely had a lot of practice with a lot of my mentors. It was just a one-on-one interview, and I will rehearse with them. And you don't want to sound too rehearsed to the point where like they totally know you memorized the answer, but you want to know you want to have an idea of what to say when they ask a certain question, like why do you want to be a doctor?
I think Romina brought up a good point with practicing, whether it be traditional or MMI, just any opportunity you get to do a practice interview. I know conferences typically have them. Just take it, and the more you do, the more comfortable you'll feel with.
I wanted to go ahead and add something regarding the MMIs. So for the MMIs, I think there's really no predictability in terms of what you're going to be asked, right? You're given a scenario, and then you have to go ahead and answer the what's in question. But there's a way that you go about answering the question. For instance, let's say you're asked to consider an ethical scenario. How I approached it is I would basically reiterate the question that they were asking me, or the ethical scenarios, so that the interviewer could see if we were on the same page about what was in question. And if not, then they would tell me, oh, that's not what we're asking, or yes, that's what we're asking. And then I would go into considering all aspects of the ethical scenario, sort of like the pros and cons. I tried to walk them through my thought process, so they can see how I was reaching the conclusion that I eventually reached, and how I supported my conclusion or the stance I took. So it's very important to express your thoughts, right? This is a place where you want them to see how you think. They're asking you this because they want to see which factors you're considering. If you're quick to jump to conclusions, or if you're really thinking it through and seeing which different variables could come into effect in whatever's in question.
Right. I remember one of my mentors told me when it comes to MMI is you want to think out loud, but in a very organized manner, right? You do not want to be all over and just coming up with all these different points, or maybe being one-sided. You want to always provide both sides of the story. They want to see that when you become a physician, you can see you're able to understand your patient, not just see one perspective, but see different types of perspectives.
Shall we move on?
I believe we have one
Yeah,
question.
we have a question.
Okay.
It says, in interviews, how deep do they delve into novelties about healthcare reforms, such as Obamacare, etc.?
So when it came to my interviews, I didn't ask directly, tell me about the Affordable Care Act. However, since I was an enrollment counselor, they would expect me to know about the Affordable Care Act and to know, perhaps more details. But I didn't have any interview specifically asked me, tell me about Obamacare. I'm not sure if you guys had those kind of questions.
I had a question. I don't remember exactly what was asked, but essentially they wanted to know if I was familiar with how the Affordable Care Act was going to change healthcare. But that was about the only question that I was asked like that.
Yeah, I didn't have a question about the Affordable Care Act.
But then again, that was in the traditional interview, so that's why in the traditional interviews, you don't really know what they're gonna ask, but they're gonna ask questions that they're not gonna ask in MMI, I guess.
But it's definitely something you should read about and have in the back of your mind and some basic knowledge about it.
And I think if you don't do it already, I think that it's very useful to um, just listen to things like NPR or different news stations, just to be continuously caught up with what's going on in the world. Um, and after secondaries, after you do so much reflecting about yourself and your life experiences, um, the interview kind of just comes natural, because you've been thinking about yourself for such a long time, and really reflecting on your experiences, that you know how you're going to react to certain questions, and you know how you're going to respond, especially because you're just thinking about it all of the time.
Very
So
true.
Alfonso, so going off what Alfonso said, I would also recommend, like when you go to conferences, practice sharing your story with people that don't know anything about you, such as recruiters from different schools. Because as you get comfortable talking about your story, where you face your challenges, where your insecurities about you yourself as an applicant, you become more comfortable sharing those things, and you become more articulate. And so then it's just natural when you get to your interview, and you don't really stress about it. At least that was my case in terms of preparing. Getting closer to the presentation, I didn't really find the need to necessarily prepare because I had already been doing that indirectly.
Is there any more questions, or should we move on?
I think we can move on.
Okay. So, lastly, one of the least favorite subjects of the application process is the expenses. Um, so these are just numbers to keep in mind, especially if you're going to be applying to a large number of schools, because the quantities can add up fast, and you have to plan ahead for these expenses. Um, uh, Portfolio for me was $20. Transcripts, some are free, others you have to pay for, and obviously the MCAT and whatever is involved in the MCAT if you take a course or if you don't. Um, for secondaries, they vary in prices, but most of them are in the high 80s, 90s. Um, and then for interviews, the clothes you're gonna wear and the travel expenses that you're gonna have to plan for. And if luckily there's FAP, but for some people, like in my case, I work full time and I've been working for many years now. And even though my parents don't work, I didn't qualify for FAP. So this was like a huge shock for me because now I had to cover all the expenses. And I think looking back then, if I would have known there was a few scholarships out there, I probably would have applied for them ahead of time. I would have saved money. Um, my family's not well off, so I couldn't borrow money from friends, but I did rely heavily on credit cards. And even that, looking back, I should have probably applied for credit cards that gave you travel points instead of the regular standard cards. What were you guys' experience with your expenses?
I think another thing that you can do to save money is take advantage of the hosting options that schools offer. So a lot of schools will allow you to stay with first year or second year medical student, um, and that's very helpful because that, for one, saves your hotel costs, and two, it gives you an insight to somebody at the school. So you can really ask them any question, and they can tell you. You can ask them, what can I expect tomorrow during my interview? Um, what has the school lived up to your expectations, and really get their perspective, the student perspective who's already been through it.
And this is our last slide. So, Gabby, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So when did I take my MCAT? So I took the MCAT twice. The first time I took it right before starting the post-bac program. And then after completing my post-bac program, well, the spring quarter of my post-bac program, I decided to study for the MCAT again to retake it. So then I retook it in July. The end of July, got my score at the end of August. And then when I got my score, I said, okay, I can go ahead and apply. So then I began to finalize my writing statements because prior to that, I was just too busy studying for the MCAT and then finding employment for when I was done with that. So then I actually didn't submit my primary until September 11th, and then I was verified September 22nd. I asked for my letters of recommendation, like while I was studying for my MCAT, so I could have it saved on Interfolio. Even if I didn't end up applying, I would have it there saved, and they can just change the date and update it. And then once I was verified September 22nd, I received my first screen secondary that day. And so I didn't really have an issue of receiving secondaries, even for the schools that screened. My first interview was in early December, and then I got my first acceptance in January, at the end of January. So I think for me, my timeline, I was a bit concerned with people saying, "Oh, you might be applying late in the cycle," but for me, that wasn't the case. And some of my mentors have also said, if your application is solid and the schools, want you as a student, it doesn't matter the time that you apply. Just apply with with confidence and really a strong application. And my last secondary, I sort of ended doing my secondaries in February, and then my last interview was in late February as well. Because at that point, once I got certain acceptances, I stopped going to interviews and sort of ended the process for certain schools because I knew where I would prioritize where I would see myself going over other schools.
Romina, you want to jump in next?
Sure. So I took my MCAT 3 times, and the first 2 times I took it in 2011, and the last time I took it in May of last year. So I got my score around June 8th, and I started working on my personal statement. I would say about mid-May, but it took me, a few drafts. I was going back and forth with my physician mentor, so I would say maybe like a month and a half to really finalize to have a really solid personal statement. Um, I asked for my letters of recommendation mid-May, and I used my school's letter service. And also, I submitted my AMCAS July 31st, and when it comes to transcripts, I already had all my transcripts there. So I was able to get that out of the way really fast. My LORC kind of took a while, so maybe I think even after July 31st, I was still waiting for some of LORs. And I was verified August 18th, and I thought I was verified very fast from the day I submitted my application, which was July 31st. And this when it comes, like I wish I could have started working on my secondaries before. I thought I was gonna get more like a longer time, um, waiting for them to verify my application, but I thought it was really fast actually. So, and then I started receiving secondaries the day I was verified. So August 18th, I started getting a lot of secondaries, and my last secondary was in late October. And my first interview was early December, and I got my acceptance the first few days of January.
And for me, this is Alfonso. For me, I took the MCAT. So I graduated undergrad in May of 2013, and then that's when I went to the post-bac program right after that. So that whole summer I was studying for the MCAT. I took it, I believe, September. Yeah, September of 2013. Um, and I started my personal statement, like I mentioned earlier. I started it actually before applying to the post-bac program. But in total, I would say I spent about 6 to 7 months off and on um, working on it. I asked my letter writers, probably like around June for letters of recommendation, and I submitted my actual application on July 11th. And then right after submitting that, I sent my transcripts because they told me that it would take 6 weeks to get verified. But kind of like Romina was saying, I was verified in like 3 because I was verified on August 4th. I started receiving secondaries the day that I submitted, so July 11th. I received like the automatic secondaries. And then on August 4th, that's when all of the other secondaries started coming in, and they started coming in um, fairly consistently after that day. My last secondary that I did was kind of like Gabby, like in February-ish, and my first interview was on October 24th of 2014, last year.
My name is Leo again. So I took the MCAT in June. I took it while while working full time, and actually I started working on my personal statement while studying for the MCAT. I also took a long time working on it, and I submitted my AMCAS application without actually knowing my score. I just felt very confident in my how I went into the test, and I knew I was gonna do okay, and I was satisfied with the number I was getting during my practices, and so I just went ahead and applied without actually knowing my score. Letters of recommendation, I asked like end of May, early June. I had sent all my supporting materials as far as transcripts before I actually submitted my MCAS. So as soon as my MCAS got there, it was early July. Uh, my verification process didn't take that long. I think I was verified within 3 weeks or so. Um, I started receiving secondaries that same day that I was verified, and like Alfonso said, they came pretty consistently. My last one was actually in April of this year, and I ended up getting an interview for that school too. Um, my first interview was in October, and my last one was in April. So as you can see, we all have quite different timelines, uh, and we're all going to med school. So the best thing that you can do is to ensure your best chances is submit when you're ready to submit the best application that you possibly can. And I think that's what we all did. Uh, you guys want to add anything else?
I think I just want to add that really today we're just sharing our experiences. Take what you find helpful, and then what you don't find helpful, just put it aside, and just know that these are our own personal experiences. Again, there's no specific way to get into medical school. Everyone gets in very differently. Everyone has a unique path. So we hope that this presentation helped, and this is time to ask questions if you have any. We have about 14 minutes left for the broadcast. If you have any other questions, things that we didn't cover, that sort of thing, and we'll make sure to go ahead and send this information out to you.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate what Gabby said. We are all very unique, and we have our, our individual path. Um, like she said, there's no formula to get into med school, but just have confidence that what you're doing is good enough, and that you know you will be okay when it comes to interviewing, and that you will be getting an acceptance next cycle or this cycle.
And just one thing, it is a long process. So, never, there'll be times where you're gonna be doubting yourself, and never put yourself down, and always think about, your personal statement, like what are the reasons why you're going into medicine, and try to find motivation in that, because it is a lot of work, but it's worth it, and it's just a step that you have to get over to continue on your road to becoming a doctor.
We have a couple of questions. So the first one is, did any of you visit any medical schools before applying to them? I can answer that one for myself. I didn't. I applied to some, and I mean, I was already had that connection. Like, I went to undergrad for UCLA. I went to, I'm gonna say, conferences. So I had been pretty much to each UC, but not necessarily to visit them before. For my out of state ones, the ones that I applied to and actually did secondaries for, I had never visited them really at all. And for some, I had never even talked to a admissions officer. But then when I decided to apply, I found medical students to talk to, and I started searching for them at conferences. So that was my experience with it. Do any of the other panelists want to add on to that, or now we can move on to the other question and make sure we answer them?
Well, I think we can move on. I didn't visit any of the other schools.
Yeah, me either.
Okay, the other question is, for those of you that completed the post-bac for GPA enhancement, did any of you feel that it hindered your app, screen you out of certain schools, or did it ever come up during an interview? I can start off with answering that, and then maybe Alfonso, you can add on to it. For me, actually, it didn't hinder me at all. I got a lot of interviews, and it wasn't an issue. Actually, I was the one to bring it up and really share how it helped me be a better student and better prepare me for medical school. And I focused not necessarily on my GPA enhancement, but on my personal growth, because I didn't complete. I'm not a number, like we're not numbers. I wanted to show them of why I did it, because I wanted to be comfortable with myself as an applicant and myself as a future medical student, and that's what I focused my discussion on. So for me, it never affected me in a negative way. It actually just helped me, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree with Gabby. In my experience, it actually kind of complemented the person or the characteristics that I was trying to portray to them. I feel like it showed them that I actually do take this very serious, and being in the post-bac program was an opportunity for me to demonstrate to them that I actually do have what it takes to go to medical school. Um, and like Gabby was saying, it didn't hinder anything. I was fairly successful with um, receiving secondaries and also with interviews. Um, so I don't think it will be a problem for you.
Do we have any other questions from the attendees? Andrea just wants to. She just says thank you, and thank you all of you for really coming to our webinar. And it takes a team, really. We put it together, but you met us halfway and really showed up to learn more, and have ask questions and be proactive about your process.
Yeah, and feel free. Our emails are up here right now. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions as you go on through this process. I know when I was going through the process, I definitely had a lot of questions, and just having different people to reach out to was very useful because everyone's busy, and being able to count on different people was always very helpful, time wise and knowledge wise.
And one more thing that I wanted to
Yes,
add,
definitely reach out.
when you're receiving feedback, have medical students read it, have peers, have writing specialists, have current physicians, and I also had even like residents read it. because sometimes I use basically all different perspectives that I could get. So with that said, ask people for help. Don't be afraid. It's always the asking part, that's the most intimidating, and you'll be surprised how many people are willing to help. But also be respectful if they take longer to reply because they're busy or have other commitments. Know that this profession keeps us very busy, and well, as you can see, it keeps you busy as well.
Yes, don't be afraid to reach out to us. I'm sure you're gonna have the same question we've had, on our journey. So make sure you, send us an email, and we'll be more than happy to answer your questions.
I think we have like 5 minutes, right?
We have one last question.
Okay.
Did any of you apply to DO schools? I particularly did not apply to DO schools. Did anyone else did?
I didn't.
I didn't as
I did
well.
not either.
Yeah, I didn't. So I think for me, I didn't apply to any DL schools because I didn't have any exposure to that field, so I couldn't see myself applying. That's the honest reason why I didn't.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that, Gabby. Same here.
And just one last thing, make sure you guys check out the MiMentor website, mimentor.org. If you have an account already, that's great. If you're not, make sure you open up an account and you can connect with us through mimentor.org.
And Catherine has a question. Did they ask you why you chose MD over DO? I never had that question. If anything, sometimes like, oh, why an MD versus like nursing, or why an MD? Just overall, why an MD? Not necessarily an MD over something. So I think if you
Yeah,
can just answer why you chose an MD, that's sufficient.
definitely. I had the question as why, with my research experience, I had the question as like, why not a PhD? And it really comes down to your motivations for medicine and how well you can express them and how sincere you are with that.
Yeah, I didn't get asked any of those questions either, like why MD over nursing, or why MD over DO. So that didn't come up in my interviews. Any last minute questions?
How many people are applying right now, this current cycle? Out of curiosity.
Catherine is.
Good.
Great, Jasmine. It's very good to start early, to know about this process early.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I guess if there's no more questions, thank you guys for tuning in, and good luck to everyone who's applying right now and who's preparing to apply for the next cycle. Uh, we hope we can continue working together and hopefully being seeing you guys enter med school and sharing that joy with you guys.
And feel free to send us any questions that you end up having later on in the process.
Yes, definitely. Thank you guys for signing in. I thought hopefully it was very beneficial to you all. And like Alfonso said, make sure you guys send in those questions. We will be more than happy to answer them.
Okay, so I am going to end the webinar. Thank you again, and hopefully we can continue working together. Good night, everyone.